So this is a reading from early on in the Oak Papers, and it's just really a kind of scene setting as much as anything. Okay. Wherever oak trees grow around the globe, people have developed a connection to them. Throughout human history, particular oaks have been favoured for their setting, for their age and size. Ancient oaks have always been special. People collect beneath their boughs. They may gather there as a place of significance within the landscape, or merely as somewhere to shelter. Whereas we humans are creatures of movement, oaks are static beings. They do not shift. They are born and they die on the same patch of earth. It is that sure-footedness that is so appealing. Ancient oaks hold a powerful sense of longevity, the sense of security, the sense of attachment to a place across time enchants us. We are drawn to old oaks. You can stand beneath a grand oak and know that your more distant ancestors did so too. Oaks hold on to the memories of earlier generations. By touching the skin of the oak, it is possible to feel some tentative trace of those that have gone before. Human beings and oaks have lived beside one another as neighbours since the earliest times, and we continue to do so. We no longer need the bodies of oak trees to build our homes or to fuel our fires, and we no longer need acorns to sustain us through hard years and meagre harvests. Yet on some level, we still lean on oak trees. In ways we do not fully understand, we need them.
That's fabulous. And I think that really sort of sets the scene, doesn't it, for the book, really? I mean, I think of this book as a journey. So I wonder if we could describe you as the world's worst travel writer from the point of view that you spent the whole journey in one place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, no, absolutely. I mean, my background is actually in travel writing.
Is it really?
I did a PhD on travel writing, so I know a fair bit about it. And yeah, there's a fantastic Frenchman that wrote a book because he was confined to his room, and he wrote a book about being in his room in the 18th century in Paris. But absolutely, what is better than going and sitting beside an ancient oak tree and having the legitimacy of a project like this to actually just sit there and observe.
Yeah,
and anyone who's just done that with nature, whether it's birdwatch or whatever, if you stop yourself from moving, then the creatures will come to you, kind of thing. Yeah,
and of course we're all used to being stuck in one place at the moment, aren't we?
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? It's so true. We have become static beings. Yeah.
Your day job sounds very intriguing. MA in wild writing courses. What do you think of as wild writing? It may not be what we necessarily think of first off.
Yeah, it's a great one, isn't it? It's a fantastic title, and I think as much as anything, the subtitle to the MA at the University of Essex, I think, probably sort of sums it up. And at the moment, that is literature, landscape, and the environment. So it's some sort of hovering around such, narratives of landscape, the literature, the culture, the kind of that a landscape has evolved with. So you might have essentially a notion of the human contact, both with the natural world and with the layers of the knowledge that have evolved on a particular landscape. Now that sounds all a bit perhaps academic, but what it then involves essentially practically is walking, getting out into the natural world. So one of the things that's kind of core to the MA course is going on field trips and what we talk about is literally stepping out of the seminar room studying texts, looking at literature, looking at cultural aspects, and then stepping out into the stunning Wivenhoe Park at the University of Essex, and maybe going and literally going and gathering next to an ancient oak tree and talking about this is where John Constable stood or whatever. So there's I think it's about kind of exploring layers of the natural world. And human interactions with,
Okay. And of course, the Oak Papers isn't your first book, is it? You've done several before. How different an experience was this one to those?
I think, I think to a certain extent, any book is. I write non-fiction books. I tell my creative writing students, I've got a couple of novels tucked away in a shelf, which is true, which is true. But really, I'm a non-fiction writer in truth. And I think so. There are elements in which you start with a kind of a notion for a project, and that evolves, and to a certain extent, the Oak Papers began with me. I was actually working at the Honeywood School in Coggeshall, sort of 4 days a week at that point, and just started running the MA in wild writing. And as much as anything, I'd just finished a book and writing about literary figures in Essex, and I was kind of looking for a new project as much as anything. And on the way back between work and home, there's the stunning Marks Hall estate. And I just thought, you know what, I might just go and sit next to that really nice oak tree there. And I'd been to it once before, many years before. And so I kind of literally stopped off and arranged to meet an amazing guy called Jonathan Jukes, who some of you will probably know and have worked with, etc. But Jonathan was great because I explained it to him, and I think a lot of people would have just thought, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And I said, look, Jonathan, what I'd really like to do is just come and sit next to this 800-year-old oak tree, at different times of the day and night and through the seasons, in the snow and the rain. I just want to do that. I want to get to know the ecology of the tree. It's a kind of learning process. That was my initial concept. And Jonathan was great because he just kind of he often doesn't say much, and then he just kind of went, yeah, okay, and he just completely got it right from the beginning. He was really enthusiastic, really supportive, as Marks Hall Estate were, and so that I was enabled to just kind of sneak in through a kind of back door, a little gate, which kind of added to the mystique as well, for this project, and and that's that was back in 2012, so it's wow. It was a while ago. And I spent a lot of time doing research kind of into the ecology and, looking at the various, the bugs and the beetles and the flies and, the incredible, collection of creatures that live supported by the oak tree. And then it kind of evolved, and I started looking at, not just the actual tree itself from sitting there, though that was a pretty stunning thing to do, but started going to the British Library a lot and looking at kind of the ways in which humans had interacted with oak trees, and that opened up a whole area of research that I knew very little about and was fascinating. Was fascinating.
I mean, because as a reader of the book, it almost feels like two parts. You've got the initial section around the Honeywood Oak. You're spending a lot of time there. You're describing the wildlife that you're seeing and feelings as well about protectiveness of this oak tree and its age. And then you step away from that and look at oaks in a more general way and start to expand the horizon almost to other people and their experiences. But I wondered if we could just concentrate on Honeywood Oak at the moment for anybody that hasn't been to Marks Hall or doesn't know the history of this tree. It is a remarkable tree, isn't it?
It is a remarkable tree. I mean, it's an 800-year-old oak tree that's now very well looked after by the Marks Hall estate, crew, but its history is fascinating. And this is what I learned literally on that first meeting with Jonathan Jukes at the Honeywood Oak, is that up until around 60 years ago, there would have been around 300 other oaks of a similar age. So it would have been one of many, And what had happened in this recent history is that in the 1950s, effectively these ancient oaks were felled for cash. As essentially the estate was on its knees, as many small English estates were following the Second World War, and this narrative of this lone ancient oak being kind of left from the splinters of this forest that have been chopped down, just kind of like, it genuinely was quite a shocking thing. I didn't know this story, and so this then became another part of the if you like, the narrative of this single oak, which was quite a stunning thing. And I talk about in the book. I have met up with people that worked there in the woods in the 1950s, cutting down these trees.
Because you met with Richard Cromack, didn't you? Who, again, I know, lovely guy, really into his nature. But he was a young guy at the time working on cutting down the woods. Was that right?
Yeah, I mean this, because what it reminds is at the time, there's no blame attached in a way to either individual. I mean, Richard himself was a teenager, I think, actually.
Yeah.
And he just started work for Manns, which was the company responsible, given the job of felling. But what also, it reminded me that, in a time of kind of climate emergency, my grandchildren are going to look back at this time and they will be saying, and do you know what they did? They did nothing about it. And, the same sort of way of looking back and saying, well, you can't blame the individuals, but collectively. And that's a really interesting additional kind of sort of sideline to the way of looking back into the 1950s and seeing this action that we kind of go, oh, that seems very harsh, seems ridiculous to cut down this ancient woodland. So there's all this aspect as well was playing around. But there were a number of local figures who were amazing to talk to, and what it did for my project of getting to know the ecology of an ancient oak tree was that it just evolved. Because you suddenly had this amazing story about this landscape. And as you say, the Honeywood Oak on its own is just a fantastic story. I mean, it was planted, it was a sapling when the Magna Carta was signed. If anyone can get themselves imaginatively to the early 13th century, they're doing pretty well. But this is it's lived through the English Civil War. We know that soldiers from the English Civil War gathered underneath the Honeywood Oak, etc., under General Honeywood, as they then marched down to the siege of Colchester, as dictated by Daniel Defoe. I mean, it's like, it embeds itself into these moments of English history, if you like. And that's what oaks do when they become ancient, is that we muse and kind of skew into their history our own human histories. And that's, that's another fascinating aspect that I enjoy exploring in the book.
Yeah. So, when I was a kid, I grew up in Wormingford, and so we knew Ronald Blythe, and we used to camp in his garden, and it was just an amazing sort of place to be. But you did talk to him, and he was saying about how country folk kind of almost relate their ancestors to these really ancient oak trees. They touch the tree that maybe their grandfather or great grandfather did.
Yeah, that's such a nice link, because Ronnie was great. I'd been going to him and just meeting up with him from running the MA Wild Writing, actually, and he's just such a supportive figure. I mean, he's 98 now, but I was going to him initially and talking to him about Essex literary figures for the previous book. And then I started, the book had kind of finished and he wrote the preface, so he was really sweet. And then I was kind of going back to him and just chatting to him about the countryside life, cups of tea. And as I say, and about oaks, and he would say, he'd just always have some brilliant line, and it was such a lovely way, because I'm city born, so I come from West London, so this is kind of a new world to me, the country world. But that idea of the village oak that people gather beneath on the village green, and he just put it so well. I mean, as you have, of this idea of a kind of physicality of touch, and there is something very physical as well. But I mean, you take children to an oak tree and they just immediately kind of touch the bark and give it a hug and stuff, and then kind of try and climb into it. Now, as adults, I think we slightly sort of hold back a bit. We kind of, oh well, and then inevitably you touch it. And that idea of the touch of the human skin on the oak skin, and then back through generations. I think it's really powerful. I think, I think as humans, we get that. We just completely get that. Particularly in a little village, the idea of generations of a single family, recognizing and getting a connection to each other through a single living being, like an oak tree, is brilliant, isn't it? It's brilliant.
Yeah. You also sort of mention, I think a couple of times actually, this sort of feeling of protection when you walk underneath the umbra of the oak itself.
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think that's true. I think it's accentuated actually when you step into an oak tree, as I like to think of it, as in when you climb into. I think even more so. I think there's a sense in which you're slightly removed from the world. You kind of do fall into some sort of embrace of the oak. And again, I feel that there's a real kind of human sensation that goes along with that. What happened was I started going to an oak tree. The Marks Hall Honeywood Oak is a drive for me. It's about a kind of 15-minute drive. And I started to realise that there were oak trees around me, obviously, where I live in Little Maplestead as well. And I started going to a really beautiful oak tree. It's not 800 years old, but I could climb into it, and I could just climb into this oak tree on Two Oak Hill, and just sit there. And there was something so meditative, so calming about that process, that I started kind of being drawn into other aspects of the ways in which, humans and oaks interact, if you like, if I can put it like that.
You did get to climb into the Honeywood Oak at one stage, but it wasn't quite as the sort of romantic kind of clambering up the trunk that you'd expected.
No, you're right. It was, again, brilliantly organised by Jonathan Jukes and the Honeywood, the Marks Hall estate. But yeah, I was hoping to kind of just be left there in the bowl, in the, kind of whatever it was, about 15, 20 foot up. And I was just hoping to kind of lounge around there reading, poetry, oak poetry for the day or something, and kind of musing and just watching the birds and stuff. But of course, unfortunately, with the old health and safety stuff, they couldn't leave me up there. It would have been too dangerous. And I get that. But they organised for me to be kind of roped up and clambered up there with an expert tree climber, and so we had a fantastic time up there. I ended up going up twice actually, and I keep Ian, the guy that's now in charge of the Honeywood Oak. I keep trying to remind myself to try and organise another one, because if you go up in kind of May time when the blue tits are just feeding, it's just amazing, because you're just immersed in life, all the leaves are coming out and everything, and you're up there, and again, as we're saying, if rather than you try and do too much, if you just sit there and just observe, it's just the most amazing thing. So yeah, it's a good reminder. I'm going to have to get back to Ian and say, can we do it again in May? It's a stunning thing, but it led me to recognise this really important aspect about humans and oaks, is that they don't we do just sit next to oaks. That's one of the things we do. We touch oaks, we hug oaks, and we climb into oaks. And that has always happened with humans. And then as I was looking at the kind of, if you like, the cultural and historical aspects of humans and oaks, you can look at, the English King Charles II, who escapes being killed by climbing and hiding in an oak. It's a famous part of our cultural heritage, if you like. And and all these aspects, if you go back into kind of into ancient history, go back to the Greek writers, again, their depiction is of the people of these isles, the Druids, having this very, very kind of sacred religious relationship with oaks, and a very much kind of ceremonial process of climbing into the oaks in order to collect the mistletoe, etc. These amazing visions of the ways in which humans have interacted and climbed into oak trees, since prehistory.
And you talk about that, the sort of the way that words, words like druid and pagan, they have meaning, don't they? They're not just made up words. They actually have meaning.
Yeah, I mean, this was not my immediate research, but as in it was my research. I didn't come up with these thoughts, but yeah, it's commonly accepted that the word druid probably is derived from the same sense as dryad, and also that druid comes from two terms meaning oak knowledge. So it is literally kind of linking the druid with the oak tree from prehistory. Yeah.
Now, one of the parts of the book that really sent a shiver up my spine was the talk of the green children. This was something that kind of took me back to my childhood and my absolute fervent belief that hobbits existed and that you could go out and talk to Wurzel Gummidge or whatever. But it's an interesting series of tales, and actually linked in with an experience of your own as well. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's I mean, a lot of people will have heard of the Green Man and the Green Knight, and there's a famous Green Woman. Images of that are often carved into medieval cathedrals and churches. All over. Nayland, for example, just down the road. Is stunning Green Man figure. But what we've also got in these parts is we've got an amazing narrative of green children that's been written down for us from Ralph of Coggeshall, of all places, back in the 13th century. So for those that don't know the story, it's essentially of two children that turn up in the village of Woolpit. You can still go there. There's just a stunning little museum if you ever get up to Woolpit in Suffolk. This story as it is of these two children that just arrive in the village unexpectedly, and they're green, and they seem to have come from another world. That is the simplest and quickest way of summing it. And to read the whole of Ralph of Coggeshall, this esteemed monk, this kind of his cultural historian, it's the most amazing story to read. So yeah, I was kind of immersed, if you like, in exploring oak lore, cultural histories, stories such as this of Ralph of Coggeshall, and I was, as you do in the country, I think, I was getting up at dawn most days and going out and being in the natural world. And I did have this moment, and it is genuine. I'm not, I did not make it up. In that, maybe my head was filled with thoughts of green children, etc. But I went out. I have a little field that I got at the same time as this little cottage, and I was just in the field one really early morning. That kind of just the pre-dawn, kind of darkness feel. And it was fantastic, and it was the grey was just filtering, kind of thing, and then I saw this figure run past on the road, and And I kind of just glanced and almost didn't think about it. And then, you know, in that way you do, kind of a couple of seconds later, it was like, what was that? It's like, it's pre-dawn. There's something, and all I caught was this kind of long hair, as if of a kind of, I don't know, a 10-year-old child or something like that running along. And so I kind of went and tried to see where it had gone. But, you know, it gone. I mean, I don't know, you know, but, you know, from my previous research that I'd done, you know, that in the countryside particularly, you know, the stories of kind of people like Puck and these sprites, these goblins of the countryside, you know, fairies, you know, I think more and more, God, you know, if you look on Instagram and Twitter and social media, it's becoming far more kind of accepted as a thing that to be talked about and to almost be accepted that there are spirits in the countryside, kind of thing.
Yeah,
now, I'm from the city, so I'm a bit skeptical. I'm a bit like,
yeah.
what's all that about? But genuinely, it was a fascinating moment, slightly weird, slightly spooky.
Yeah.
I couldn't explain it. And I think that's often just like, I couldn't explain it.
Sometimes there are things that are best left unexplained, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true.
I mean, I was also fascinated by some of the science because, I mean, we've been talking about some of the mythology and the ancient history, but there's science behind a feeling of well-being amongst trees. And we all know that green space is good for us. It's a good healing process. But also, you got to speak to Chris Gibson, who'll be a friend of many people at the Society. And he was talking about this almost like a sort of mycelium network that links trees together and allows them to communicate in, you know, almost in a sort of a networking way.
Yeah, I mean that's been this stunning you know, forestry knowledge that's been coming out in the last sort of 20 years or so. That's kind of emerged into accepted scientific belief that through these, as you say, these mycelial networks, this mitochondrial level of communication that's existing between trees. It is quite mind-blowing. I mean, that really is quite mind-blowing stuff. And the way in which, I mean, I think Chris was brilliant. I mean, Chris is obviously, he's a legend in these parts and he's a kind of go-to figure, but he just puts things so well as well. So, I mean, I'd done a certain amount of research into, you know, these, what's known as the wood wide web, if you want to call it such, slightly crass terminologies, but it is the way in which trees communicate with each other. I mean, it's as simple as that. They connect with each other, and as he said, you know, one oak will, if it's being attacked by caterpillars, for example, it will pass messages through its root network to other trees saying, raise your tannin levels, I'm being attacked by caterpillars. So there's this kind of sense of community and connectivity between trees that we now have kind of scientific evidence for. And that's the big shift, because obviously largely in our world, we're run on a trust in science. That's what we do. So if you prove it in the science, then everyone has to go, oh, okay, trees do communicate with each other. Chris puts things he knows the science and then he puts them just very beautifully. So he was a very good person. Him and Jude formed a really lovely section in the book, because I just went and chatted with them in their gorgeous flat in Wivenhoe, and we kind of got a number of kind of threads, a number of kind of narratives, if you like, that we discussed. And this was one of them, as you say, the scientific layerings.
And it makes you wonder what happens when, you know, the whole of the woodland is cut down around the Honeywood Oak, and does it sense that connection has gone? It's almost mind-blowing, really.
It is. I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's that really powerful you know, analogy in a lot of ways, but it's just a powerful sense in which once you start having this you know, bona fide scientific knowledge that trees communicate with each other, the notion of then chopping down a whole community of them, it's a massacre. It becomes a massacre. And it, you know, not to even begin to think about the the biodiversity impact, the impact on the whole ecology, the literally hundreds of thousands, millions of creatures that are going to be impacted by such actions by one species on the natural world. So you're absolutely right. It is mind blowing. Yeah.
James, I just wondered if you could do another reading for us from the book, just to give a flavour of the Oak Papers.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a slightly more mystical one. So this is these kind of a couple of diary entries, really, in this little section from around what I like to call this sort of turning time. That time in kind of when you're working towards the shortest day, and you just. And then suddenly you have this shift, and then that the light is starting to return in around 21st December that time. And it's I was spending a lot of time out in the field, particularly with one oak tree called the field oak that I just started again in terms of knowledge of humans and oaks to go and sit next to. And what I was trying to kind of nurture was a sense of meditation, of kind of oak meditation in some ways, which might sound a bit crazy, but I have spoken to kind of Buddhists and a number of kind of practitioners about this, and so it kind of had a certain validity. Anyway, look, I'll give you a little reading. Yeah. 11th of December. I sit beside the field oak and feel the fervour of the fanatic. My soul seems ever more in communion with whatever spirit or being it is I contemplate before me. Starlings stand among the higher branches, then shoot into a gunmetal sky. The fires in the west are dying down. The pheasants call the tune of dusk. Others join in. Blackbirds seek to settle. I know the patterns so well now. It is the calling out before the quiet, before the light goes out. 14th December. The moon is a vast white orb tonight, a circle of light. I watch from the oak in the field. The moon shadow haunts the field and flickers in fragments on leaves of bramble below and on the remaining oak leaves around me. Earlier, I watched the moon as it climbed the eastern horizon. Then it was even vaster. When it first rose, it was brushed with soft hues of honeydew. Now it is paler. I will watch it as it ascends the sky, as its ashen sheen grows ever whiter. 22nd of December. A rug of frozen oak leaves lines the floor of the field. The sun rises golden on this solstice day. It is the turning time. Light gathers. Sunshine seeps back into the day. I know the world as never before. The oak is warm beneath me. I feel its skin on mine. I close my eyes and face the winter sun.
So this book really sort of spans both science and, well, I wouldn't say mystical, but certainly spiritual sort of values of the countryside and oak trees in particular. Do you ever find that there's a rub between the two?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult way of describing things, isn't it? Because it just, as I say, it started by going sitting next to an 800-year-old oak tree, and it kind of evolved. And I think to a certain extent it had to evolve the way it did, because if you start doing the research, and I spent hours in the British Library because there's been a lot written about oak trees, from right back from, as I say, from Pliny the Elder. From Homer. You go to Homer, he's writing about oak trees, Odysseus needs to consult the oracle at Dodona before he returns to Ithaca, and the oracle tells him by the whispering of oak leaves. I mean, it's so embedded. And if you don't go into some sort of I don't know, spiritual, cultural layering, then you're not telling the story of humans and oaks. I mean, look, there's your example. Homer, okay, in ancient Greece, the way that the word of truth or whatever, of gods or whatever, it was whispered through the flickerings, the noises that oak leaves make in the wind. I mean, that's ancient Greece. I mean, you know, that if that's not spiritual, or what, I don't know whether you want to call it spiritual or whatever. So I knew that had to be a part, and I was going on that journey. You know, I was kind of stepping on that journey as I went from the kind of Honeywood Oak, and then I was like, this is amazing, you know, and as you say, I mean, I was kind of picking up on talking to scientists and hearing their truths, and then speaking to others and hearing their truths, you know, speaking to, you know, kind of people that would call themselves, you know, official kind of pagans. And then, you know, but I'd already, from my previous book, I'd done quite a lot of research into, you know, pagan. What the word pagan is just from the Latin pagus, of the countryside. That is all it means, as opposed to civilized, of the city. And if we kind of, you know, have this knowledge, then we don't make these kind of slightly crass divides between the two, and the two go well together. And in a way, you can just think of it as a kind of Romanization issue of British culture and British ways of being in the countryside. And I think if you keep that kind of concept, then you're somewhere closer to a true appreciation of how humans and oaks have always got on, really. So yeah, it was fascinating how this story of an 800-year-old oak tree kind of evolved, really. Yeah, it did. Yeah. It did evolve. Yeah.
And was this the book that you intended to write, or did it just go off in a horribly strange direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, as I say, it was about 8 years from kind of conception, first seated, if you like, first standing next to the Honeywood Oak, to publication. I mean, pretty ish, but it was about 8 years. And no, you're absolutely right. I mean, my initial notion, my concept was to sit by the Honeywood Oak and learn. I felt like I didn't know enough about the ecology, you know, the nature of the oak, and that was it. And I got these wonderful books, you know, like this, which, you know, these kind of books that will tell you all about the different stiletto flies that live within the heart rot, that only live within the heart rot of ancient oaks, you know, the forest silver stiletto, you know, and all these. So this was my initial idea, was to write what would have been really quite a dry book that maybe a few naturalists would be interested in, but that perhaps not too many others would. And then I realized that, you know, as soon as Jonathan started telling stories of 300 oaks being chopped down, and then the human aspects, you know, of meeting people like Ronald Blythe and hearing this kind of wonderful sense of connectivity through generations, just a different kind of book evolved. But
I'd like to thank you for speaking to me at length about the Oak Papers. I mean, it's populated with the most amazing characters, and central to that is this one oak tree, and it is a really good read. So I'd encourage everybody from the Society to get down to Red Lion Books and buy a copy. Is there anything that you took away from this whole experience that you know, you weren't expecting going into it?
I mean, thanks, Darren. It's been great. It really is. It's lovely to chat. And I mean, there were so many experiences that were powerful and impacting. You know, I've kind of related a couple of them today. I mean, I think the central, most important one is just about, as humans, we need to be in the natural world. You know, I know it for myself. If I'm outside, I'm a happier being, you know. And I think one aspect of that is, if you can, go and spend time in the woods. You know, it's not easy if you're living in a flat in North London or something, but even so, just spend it. And now we have lots of, you know, if you like, scientific backup to that central notion that being in the natural world is good for us, that we are better beings when we're outdoors. And I think, you know, it's what I've always kind of known myself as a kind of slightly feral child, you know, to what I'm teaching as director of the MA wild writing, you know, and I think, you know, this book kind of, again, if there's a central message, it's that we're meant to be outdoors, really.
Well, that's a good one to take away, and let's hope that before long we all will be back outdoors. But thank you, James. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and hopefully we'll catch up with the next book.
Yeah, lovely, Darren. I love to.
Okay then. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.